The smell of cordite and sweat hung thick in the desert air as Staff Sergeant Maya Chen gripped the M4 rifle, her knuckles white against the polymer grip. 500 Marines surrounded the firing range in a semicircle, their voices creating a low rumble that vibrated through the sand beneath her boots. But Maya heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the target downrange, a standard silhouette that had witnessed countless attempts to break Colonel James Hartwell's legendary combat marksmanship record. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Support staff thinks she can play with the big boys. Colonel Hartwell's voice cut through the desert silence like a blade. He stood 20 feet behind her, arms crossed over his chest, the silver eagles on his collar catching the harsh Afghan sun. His weathered face bore the kind of smirk that had crushed dreams, ended careers. Maybe we should get you back to your computer, Chun. Leave the real soldiering to the Marines. Maya's finger trembled against the trigger, guard not from fear, but from the effort of restraining herself. 3 years. 3 years of being called support staff, despite her infantry training. 3 years of being relegated to logistics while her male counterparts earned their combat stripes. 3 years of watching Colonel Hartwell dismiss every woman who dared to excel in his domain. The morning had started like any other at Forward Operating Base Granite. Maya had been updating supply manifests in the sweltering command tent when Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez burst through the canvas flap, her eyes wild with excitement and something else, hope, maybe, or desperation. "Chun, you have to see this," Sarah had whispered, clutching a worn piece of paper. "The Colonel's challenge. He's opened it to everyone, for the first time in 15 years. Maya had taken the paper with steady hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The challenge was simple in concept, devastating in execution. Break Colonel Hartwell's combat marksmanship record and earn a transfer to any unit of your choosing. Fail and face whatever punishment the Colonel deemed appropriate. The record itself was the stuff of legend achieved during the Second Battle of Fallujah, witnessed by dozens of Marines who still spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. Why is he doing this? Maya had asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. New directive from Division, Sarah had explained, her voice barely audible. They're mandating combat integration assessments. He has to prove his unit's readiness across all personnel categories. She had paused, meeting Maya's eyes. "This is your chance, Chun. Maybe the only one you'll get." Now, standing on the firing line with the weight of expectation and prejudice pressing down like the desert heat, Maya felt the familiar burn of determination in her chest. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations of the Marines who had gathered to watch what they assumed would be her humiliation. $20 says she doesn't even qualify. Hartwell's gonna tear her apart. What's she trying to prove? Maya closed her eyes and let their words wash over her, transforming doubt into fuel. When she opened them again, the target downrange seemed to shimmer with possibility. She had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone knew, not just for this challenge, but for the chance to prove that excellence had no gender, that courage wore many faces, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one everyone underestimated. The range master, Master Sergeant Torres, approached with the official scoring sheets. His weathered face was carefully neutral, but Maya caught the slight nod he gave her, barely perceptible, but enough to remind her that not everyone had written her off. "Staff Sergeant Chun," Torres announced, his voice carrying across the desert. "You have been briefed on the parameters of Colonel Hartwell's challenge. Standard combat scenarios, mixed distances, varying conditions. Time limit of 45 minutes. The record to beat stands at 93% accuracy across all scenarios, with bonus points for speed and tactical innovation." Maya nodded, her mouth dry but her hands steady. She had studied every detail of Hartwell's legendary performance, had spent countless hours analyzing the techniques that made him one of the most feared marksmen in the corps. But she had also spent those hours developing her own approach, one that no one, especially not the colonel, would see coming. "Before we begin," Colonel Hartwell's voice boomed across the range, "I want everyone here to understand what we're witnessing. This isn't about equality or proving a point. This is about combat readiness, about the harsh realities of warfare that don't care about your feelings or your politics." He began to pace behind the firing line, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "In Fallujah, when I set this record, Marines were dying around me, real Marines. Men who understood that warfare isn't a game, isn't a place for social experiments. That record represents something sacred, the absolute pinnacle of what a warrior can achieve when everything is on the line." Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with Hartwell's speeches. She had heard variations of this same theme for 3 years, watched as he systematically undermined every woman who served under his command. But today, something was different. Today, she had the chance to let her rifle do the talking. "Colonel," she said, turning to face him for the first time since taking her position. Her voice was steady, professional, but loud enough for every Marine present to hear. "Permission to speak freely, sir." Hartwell's eyebrows raised, clearly not expecting the interruption. "Granted, Staff Sergeant." "Sir, with respect, records are meant to be broken. That's what makes them meaningful." Maya paused, letting her words settle over the assembled Marines. "And every Marine here, regardless of their job or their background, took the same oath to defend this country. Maybe it's time we let actions speak louder than assumptions." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Maya saw several Marines exchange glances. She had crossed a line, challenged Hartwell publicly in a way that no one had done in years. The colonel's face flushed red above his collar, but before he could respond, Master Sergeant Torres stepped forward. "Range is hot," Torres announced. "Staff Sergeant Chen, you may begin when ready." Maya turned back to the firing line, feeling the weight of 500 pairs of eyes on her back. In the distance, the first target waited a simple bullseye at 100 meters. Child's play, really, except for the pressure, except for the knowledge that failure here would mean more than just personal disappointment. It would mean validating every prejudice, every dismissive comment, every barrier that had been placed in her path. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, felt the familiar comfort of the stock against her cheek. The weapon became an extension of her body, and for a moment, everything else faded away, the crowd, the colonel, the crushing weight of expectation. There was only the target, the rifle, and the steady rhythm of her breathing. But as Maya prepared to take her first shot, a movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A young female Marine, probably 19 or 20, had pushed to the front of the crowd. The girl's eyes were fixed on Maya with an intensity that spoke of desperate hope, of dreams hanging by a thread. Behind her, Maya could see other women Marines, sailors, even civilian contractors who had found excuses to be present for this moment. Maya realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't just about breaking a record or proving a point to Colonel Hartwell. This was about every woman who had been told she wasn't strong enough, wasn't tough enough, wasn't Marine enough. This was about the girl in the front row and all the girls who would come after her. The first shot rang out across the desert, the sound sharp and final in the morning air. Maya watched through her scope as the bullet struck the target dead center, sending a small puff of sand from the backstop into the air. She worked the bolt smoothly, chambered another round, and fired again. And again, but as she transitioned to the second target, a moving silhouette at 200 meters, Maya became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere around her. The crowd had gone silent, their casual chatter replaced by an almost religious stillness. Even Colonel Hartwell had stopped pacing, his attention fixed on the target's downrange. Maya's third shot missed the center ring by millimeters, and she heard a collective intake of breath from the crowd. but she pushed the near miss from her mind, focusing on the rhythm that had carried her through countless training sessions in the pre-dawn darkness. She had always been her own harshest critic, had spent years perfecting her technique in solitude, because no one else believed it was worth developing. The moving target scenario was where Hartwell had made his reputation, tracking and engaging multiple threats while under simulated fire. Maya adjusted her position, feeling the sand shift beneath her body, and began the complex sequence that had taken her months to master. But as she lined up her first shot, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Colonel Hartwell was no longer standing behind the firing line. He had moved to a position where he could observe her technique more closely, and his expression had changed from dismissive arrogance to something much more dangerous, genuine attention. Maya realized that she had miscalculated something crucial. She had assumed that Hartwell's prejudice would blind him to her capabilities, that his arrogance would prevent him from recognizing a real threat until it was too late. But the colonel hadn't survived multiple combat deployments by underestimating his enemies, and Maya was beginning to understand that in his mind. That's exactly what she had become. The question that would haunt the rest of this challenge was no longer whether Maya could break the record. She was beginning to believe she actually could. The question was what Colonel Hartwell would do to stop her, and how far he would go to protect a legacy that had defined his career and his career and his career identity for over 15 years. As Maya prepared for the next phase of the challenge, a complex urban warfare simulation that would test every skill she had spent years developing in secret, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much more dangerous than a simple marksmanship contest. She was challenging not just a record, but an entire system that had invested decades in keeping her exactly where she was. The desert sun climbed higher in the sky, and the temperature began to soar. But Maya Chen had been forged in harder places than this, had survived challenges that would have broken lesser people. Today, she would discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice for the chance to rewrite the rules. The next target appeared. Downrange, a hostage scenario that had broken many careers and shattered countless dreams. Maya took a deep breath, steadied her rifle, and prepared to change everything. Maya's hands moved with practiced precision as she adjusted her rifle sling, but her mind traveled 3,000 miles and 6 years backward to a small apartment in San Diego, where a 17-year-old girl had made a promise that would reshape her entire life. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," her mother had said that night, sitting on the edge of Maya's narrow bed. The acceptance letter to UC Berkeley lay on the nightstand, its official seal catching the streetlight that filtered through their thin curtains. "You're brilliant, Mia. Engineering degree, good job, nice house, that's a life worth having." Maya had stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of expectations and the pull of something deeper, something that couldn't be satisfied with safety and conventional success. On her desk, barely visible in the darkness, sat a different letter, one from the Marine Corps' recruiter who had spent 3 months convincing her that she had something unique to offer her country. "It's not about proving anything, Mom," Maya had whispered. "It's about becoming who I'm supposed to be." Her mother's silence had spoken volumes. Carmen Chun had fled El Salvador at 19, pregnant and terrified, carrying nothing but hope and an unshakable determination to give her daughter opportunities she had never had. The idea that Maya would voluntarily choose a path filled with danger and uncertainty felt like a rejection of everything Carmen had sacrificed to achieve. Now, 6 years later, Maya understood her mother's fear in ways that her teenage self never could. But she also understood something else, that becoming the person you're meant to be sometimes requires disappointing the people who love you most. The morning routine at FOB Granite began at 0500 hours, but Maya had been awake since 0400. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept past dawn, couldn't remember when the habit of rising early had transformed from discipline to necessity to something approaching salvation. In the quiet hour before the base stirred to life, she belonged to herself in a way that daylight never allowed. Her quarters were Spartan even by military standards: a narrow bunk, a metal locker, a small desk where she wrote letters home that she never sent. The walls were bare except for a single photograph: Maya and her mother on graduation day from Marine Corps basic training. Carmen had made the trip to Paris Island despite her fears, despite the arthritis that made the long flight agony, despite the part of her that still hoped Maya would change her mind about this impossible dream. In the photograph, Carmen's smile was genuine but fragile, the expression of a woman who had learned to love what she couldn't understand. Maya treasured that image not just for the memory it preserved, but for what it represented: the moment her mother had chosen love over fear, pride over disappointment. Maya's morning began with PT, but not the standard unit exercises that Colonel Hartwell supervised with military precision and thinly veiled disdain for anyone who didn't meet his arbitrary standards. Instead, she ran alone through the desert that surrounded the base, her boots pounding out a rhythm against the hardpan that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Running had always been meditation for Maya, a way to process the complexities of life that seemed too large for normal thought. This morning, as she pushed herself through the 8th mile of what should have been a 5-mile route, she found herself thinking about the conversation that had started everything. It had been 3 weeks earlier, during the monthly logistics briefing that Maya attended as the senior supply specialist. Colonel Hartwell had been discussing the upcoming joint training exercise with other units, emphasizing the need for proper Marine representation in all combat scenarios. The thing about combat, Hartwell had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged on such matters, is that it reveals truth. It strips away all the political correctness, all the social engineering, and shows you what people are really made of. Some are warriors, others— He had paused, his eyes finding Maya in the assembled group. Others are support staff. The dismissal in his voice had been casual, almost thoughtless, but Maya had felt it like a physical blow. Not because she believed it. She had stopped believing Hartwell's pronouncements about her limitations years ago, but because of what it represented: the systematic erosion of possibility, the death by 1,000 cuts that was designed to make her doubt her own worth. But something had shifted in that moment. Maybe it was the way Lieutenant Rodriguez had tensed beside her, or the uncomfortable silence that had followed Hartwell's comment. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 3 years of similar dismissals finally reaching critical mass. Or maybe it was simply that Maya had grown tired of carrying anger like a stone in her chest, had decided to transform it into something more useful. After the briefing, she had approached Master Sergeant Torres in the supply depot where she spent most of her days managing inventory and processing requisitions. Torres was a career Marine who had served with distinction in 3 combat theaters, but more importantly, he was one of the few senior NCOs who judged people by their competence rather than their demographics. "Gunny," Maya had said, using the informal term that indicated respect without civility, "I need to ask you about something." Torres had looked up from the manifest he was reviewing, his weathered face curious. "Shoot, Chun." "The Colonel's marksmanship record. I know it's legendary, but I also know records exist to be broken. What would it take hypothetically for someone to challenge it?" Torres had been quiet for a long moment, studying Maya with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Hypothetically," he had finally said, "it would take someone with exceptional skill, extraordinary preparation, and the kind of courage that borders on stupidity." Maya had nodded, understanding the subtext. And hypothetically, where would someone acquire the skills necessary for such a challenge? That conversation had led to 6 months of secret preparation that Maya now realized had been the most important education of her life. Torres, it turned out, had his own complicated relationship with Colonel Hartwell's leadership style. While he would never openly criticize his commanding officer, he was willing to provide guidance to a Marine who showed genuine commitment to excellence. The training had begun in darkness, during those precious pre-dawn hours when the base was quiet and the desert offered the kind of solitude necessary for honest self-assessment. Torres had shown Maya advanced techniques that weren't taught in standard marksmanship courses, methods developed in the crucible of combat, refined through years of experience that couldn't be replicated in peacetime training. But the technical skills were only part of the preparation. Torres had also taught Maya about the mental aspects of competitive shooting, the psychological warfare that inevitably accompanied any challenge to established authority. The colonel's not just a good shot, Torres had explained during one of their pre-dawn sessions. He's a master of intimidation. He'll try to get in your head, make you doubt yourself before you ever touch the trigger. You need to be ready for that. Maya had thought she understood what Torres meant, but standing on the firing line with 500 Marines watching her every move, she realized that no amount of preparation could fully capture the reality of this moment. The pressure wasn't just about accuracy or speed, it was about representing every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough, while simultaneously proving herself to people who had invested years in believing she would fail. Her daily routine at FOB Granite had been carefully constructed to maintain the fiction that she was simply another logistics specialist doing her job with quiet competence. Maya arrived at the supply depot at 0630, reviewed overnight reports, and began the complex process of ensuring that 1,200 Marines had everything they needed to maintain readiness in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The work was important, critically important, but it had also become a kind of camouflage. While her male counterparts competed for attention and advancement opportunities, Maya had learned to excel in ways that didn't threaten anyone's perception of how things were supposed to work. She processed requisitions faster than anyone in the unit's history, reduced waste by 15%, and maintained inventory accuracy rates that bordered on miraculous. But excellence in logistics, Maya had discovered, was a double-edged sword. The better she performed, the more indispensable she became in her current role, and the less likely anyone was to consider her for the combat positions she had joined the Marines to pursue. Chun's got a gift for this stuff, she had overheard Hartwell telling his XO one afternoon. We need to make sure she stays where she can do the most good. The condescension in his voice had been subtle but unmistakable. Maya was valuable as a logistics specialist precisely because she was too valuable to be anything else. Her competence had become her cage. The afternoon following Torres's training sessions, Maya would return to her quarters and engage in a different kind of preparation. She had spent months studying every available record of Colonel Hartwell's legendary performance, analyzing video footage, interviewing Marines who had witnessed the achievement, and slowly constructing the tactical approach that she believed could succeed where others had failed. But the technical preparation was accompanied by something more personal, a series of letters that Maya wrote but never sent, conversations with her mother that existed only in her imagination. Dear Mom, one letter began, I know you'll never understand why I chose this life, why I walked away from the safety you worked so hard to give me. But I need you to know that everything you taught me about courage and determination led me here. You showed me what it means to fight for something larger than yourself, even when the odds are impossible. Tomorrow I'm going to do something that might change everything. I'm going to challenge a system that has spent years telling me I'm not enough, not strong enough, not Marine enough. I might fail. I probably will fail. But I'll fail as myself, not as the smaller version of myself that everyone expects me to. Maya had written dozens of these letters, working through her fears and hopes in the privacy of her quarters. She knew her mother would never read them, knew that Carmen's understanding of her daughter's military service was limited to the carefully edited versions Maya shared during their weekly phone calls. But the letters served their purpose, They helped Maya clarify why this challenge mattered, why breaking Hartwell's record was about more than personal achievement. The truth was that Maya had spent 3 years watching talented women leave the Marines in frustration, had seen brilliant officers transfer to other branches where their abilities were recognized and developed. She had watched as potential was wasted, as dreams were systematically dismantled by leaders who confused tradition with prejudice. But she had also seen something else, moments of extraordinary competence from women who had been written off by the system, flashes of capability that suggested what might be possible if barriers were removed instead of reinforced. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez was a perfect example. Brilliant, dedicated, and fearless, Rodriguez had been relegated to administrative duties despite tactical skills that surpassed most of the male officers in the unit. Maya had watched Rodriguez volunteer for dangerous assignments only to be assigned to more appropriate roles that kept her safely away from any situation where she might prove her critics wrong. The evening before the challenge, Maya had found herself in the small recreation area where off-duty Marines gathered to decompress from the relentless stress of deployment. Rodriguez had been there, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and a book she wasn't really reading. Nervous? Rodriguez had asked without looking up. Terrified, Maya had admitted, settling into the chair across from her. Good. Terror means you understand the stakes. Rodriguez had finally met Maya's eyes. You know this isn't just about you, right? This is about all of us. Maya had nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle over her like armor. The challenge wasn't just about proving herself to Colonel Hartwell or even breaking his precious record. It was about opening doors that had been locked for too long, about proving that excellence came in many forms. But as the hour of the challenge approached, Maya found herself thinking about something Torres had told her during their final training session. The hardest part, he had said, won't be the shooting. You've got the skills for that. The hardest part will be carrying everyone else's dreams without letting them drag you down. You'll be shooting for every woman who believes she's not good enough, and that's a heavy load to carry. Now standing at the firing line with the desert sun climbing toward its peak, Maya understood exactly what he had meant. The pressure wasn't just about accuracy or technique, it was about transforming years of frustrated potential into a single, perfect performance that would rewrite the rules for everyone who came after. But there was something else, something Maya had only begun to understand during the long months of preparation. This challenge was also about proving something to herself, about finally answering the question that had haunted her since that night in San Diego when she had chosen the harder path. Who was she meant to become? What was she capable of achieving when she stopped limiting herself to other people's expectations? The target's downrange shimmered in the heat, waiting to provide those answers. The second phase of Colonel Hartwell's challenge began with a scenario that Maya had studied obsessively, a simulated urban warfare environment where targets appeared and disappeared behind cover, requiring split-second decisions about threat identification and engagement priorities. It was here, according to Marine Corps' legend, that Hartwell had achieved his most spectacular success, eliminating 11 confirmed threats in under 90 seconds while taking incoming fire from multiple positions. Maya settled into her firing position, feeling the familiar burn of adrenaline mixing with the deeper current of determination that had carried her through years of preparation. But as she prepared to engage the first target, she became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. The casual murmur of conversation among the assembled Marines had taken on a different quality, less dismissive, more anticipatory. Her first 10 shots had been flawless, each bullet finding its intended mark with precision that had clearly surprised even Colonel Hartwell. But Maya knew that accuracy alone wouldn't be enough to break the record. The urban warfare phase was where legends were made or destroyed, where technical skill had to combine with tactical innovation and the kind of mental resilience that could only be tested under extreme pressure. the first target, appeared a silhouette, partially concealed behind a concrete barrier at 150 meters. Maya acquired and engaged in 1.2 seconds, watching through her scope as the bullet struck center mass. She transitioned smoothly to the second target, which emerged from behind a building facade at 200 meters, requiring a more complex lead calculation due to its lateral movement. But as Maya worked through the sequence, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Colonel Hartwell was no longer content to observe from his position behind the firing line. He had begun to move closer, ostensibly to get a better view of her technique, but his proximity was clearly intended to create psychological pressure. Interesting. Approach, Chen. Hartwell's voice came from directly behind her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. Though I notice you're taking a bit longer than necessary to acquire targets. In real combat, that hesitation would get Marines killed. Maya forced herself to ignore the commentary, but she could feel the effect it was having on her rhythm. The colonel's voice was like a physical weight pressing down on her concentration, designed to fracture the mental state that was essential for this level of performance. The third target appeared. Hostage scenario where the threat was positioned partially behind a civilian silhouette. This was the shot that had made Hartwell's reputation, a technically challenging engagement that required perfect precision and unwavering confidence. Maya studied the target through her scope, calculating angles and considering the ethical implications. That made this scenario so psychologically demanding. "Take your time, Staff Sergeant," Hartwell continued, his voice carrying just loud enough for the assembled Marines to hear. "I'm sure the hostage will understand if you need a few extra seconds to work up the courage." Maya's finger tightened on the trigger, but not from the immediate tactical demand. She had just realized that Hartwell wasn't simply trying to distract her. He was conducting a masterclass in psychological warfare for the benefit of the watching Marines, demonstrating how pressure could break down even the most technically proficient shooter. She fired, and the bullet struck its intended target with precision that sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. But instead of feeling satisfaction, Maya felt a growing awareness that the challenge had evolved beyond simple marksmanship into something much more complex and dangerous. "Lucky shot," Hartwell commented, his voice carrying just enough dismissal to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of observers. "Though I notice your muzzle control could use some work. In Fallujah, we couldn't afford to wave our weapons around like that." Maya knew the criticism was unfounded. Her muzzle discipline was flawless, honed through years of training and natural caution. But she also knew that Hartwell's comments weren't really directed at her. They were intended to provide the assembled Marines with an alternative narrative, a way to diminish her performance regardless of the actual results. The fourth target appeared, a long-range engagement at 300 meters, complicated by simulated wind conditions and the need to account for bullet drop over the extended distance. Maya made the necessary adjustments, feeling the familiar calm that came with technical challenges. But as she prepared to fire, Hartwell escalated his psychological campaign. "You know, Marines," he said, his voice taking on the conversational tone of someone sharing professional wisdom, "there's a difference between shooting at targets and shooting to save lives. Range performance doesn't always translate to combat effectiveness." Maya fired, and the bullet struck dead center at 300 meters, a shot that would have been impressive under any circumstances, but was extraordinary given the pressure and conditions. She heard several Marines whisper appreciatively, but Hartwell wasn't finished. "Of course we're not under fire here," he continued. "No incoming rounds, no Marines bleeding out while you take your time to aim. It's easy to shoot when the stakes are artificial." Maya realized that she was witnessing something she had never seen before. Colonel Hartwell's legendary composure beginning to crack. His comments were becoming more pointed, more desperate, as if her success was threatening something fundamental about his understanding of the world. The fifth target was the most challenging yet a moving target that emerged from cover, presented itself for only seconds, and required complex calculations about speed and trajectory. Maya tracked the movement through her scope, led the target based on its apparent velocity, and fired in a single fluid motion that felt more like instinct than conscious decision. The bullet struck home, and this time the crowd's reaction was impossible to ignore. Several Marines actually applauded, and Maya heard voices expressing genuine admiration for what they had just witnessed. Not bad, Hartwell conceded, but his tone suggested that he was preparing to raise the stakes. Though I should mention that this phase of the challenge typically separates the actual marksmen from the people who just got lucky during qualification. Maya understood that she had entered dangerous territory. Her success was no longer just challenging Hartwell's record, it was challenging his authority, his credibility, and the entire system of assumptions that had governed his career. She was forcing him to confront the possibility that he had been wrong about her capabilities, which meant he had been wrong about everything his prejudices had taught him to believe. The sixth target appeared, and with it came a new element of the challenge that Maya hadn't anticipated. Master Sergeant Torres approached the firing line with a grim expression and a message that changed everything. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Torres announced, "Colonel Hartwell has invoked the combat stress provision of the challenge." Maya felt her stomach drop. The combat stress provision was a rarely used aspect of the challenge that allowed the commanding officer to introduce realistic combat conditions, including simulated incoming fire, time pressure beyond the normal parameters, and psychological stress designed to replicate actual battlefield conditions. "I think it's important," Hartwell's voice boomed across the range, "that we maintain realistic standards. After all, anyone can shoot well on a quiet range with unlimited time and no distractions." Maya understood immediately what was happening. Hartwell was changing the rules in the middle of the game, introducing variables that would make success exponentially more difficult while providing him with plausible deniability if she failed. He could claim that he was simply maintaining the integrity of the challenge, ensuring that any new record was achieved under conditions comparable to his original performance. But Maya also understood something else. This escalation revealed just how threatened Hartwell felt by her success. He wouldn't have invoked the combat stress provision unless he genuinely believed she might break his record under normal conditions. In a perverse way, his attempts to sabotage her were actually validation of her capabilities. Torres's expression was carefully neutral, but Maya caught the slight shake of his head, a subtle warning that she was entering uncharted territory. No one had ever attempted to break Hartwell's record under combat stress conditions, partly because the provision had been added to the challenge specifically to make success nearly impossible. "The combat stress phase," Torres announced to the assembled Marines, "will include simulated incoming fire, reduced time limits for target engagement, and randomized scenario parameters. Staff Sergeant Chen will have 60 seconds to complete the remaining targets under these enhanced conditions." Maya felt the crowd's energy shift as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was no longer just a marksmanship demonstration. It was becoming a test of wills between a staff sergeant who refused to be diminished and a colonel who was willing to change the rules to protect his legacy. But as Maya prepared for the final phase of the challenge, she noticed something that gave her hope. The Marines who had gathered to watch what they expected to be her humiliation were now invested in her success. She could see it in their faces, hear it in the way their conversations had shifted from skeptical to supportive. Lieutenant Rodriguez had moved to the front of the crowd, her expression intense with the kind of hope that Maya recognized from her own mirror. Behind her, Maya could see other women Marines, sailors, civilian contractors who had found reasons to be present for this moment, but she also saw something else that made her blood run cold. Several of Colonel Hartwell's senior staff had joined the group of observers, their expressions suggesting that this challenge had implications far beyond a simple marksmanship contest. Maya realized that she wasn't just competing against a record. She was challenging a system that had invested decades in maintaining the status quo. The combat stress simulation began with the sharp crack of simulated gunfire from speakers positioned around the range. Maya felt her heart rate spike as her training kicked in, her body responding to the sound of incoming fire with the heightened awareness that years of preparation had programmed into her nervous system. The seventh target appeared. For only 3 seconds, partially obscured by smoke effects designed to replicate battlefield conditions. Maya acquired and engaged in 1.8 seconds, pushing the limits of what was physically possible while maintaining the precision necessary to hit a target at 250 meters. But as she transitioned to the 8th target, Maya became aware of a new element of psychological pressure that even Torres's training hadn't fully prepared her for. Colonel Hartwell had begun to provide a running commentary on her performance, ostensibly for the benefit of the observing Marines, but clearly intended to disrupt her concentration. "Notice how she's taking longer to acquire targets now," Hartwell's voice cut through the simulated gunfire. "Combat stress reveals true capabilities. Some people rise to the occasion, others ... Maya fired, striking the 8th target dead center despite the psychological pressure and the reduced engagement time. She was now only 3 targets away from completing the challenge, but she could feel the weight of expectations and the intensity of Hartwell's opposition pressing down on her like the desert heat. The 9th target was the most challenging yet, a long-range shot at 400 meters, complicated by crosswind simulation and the need to account for multiple variables while under extreme time pressure. Maya made her calculations in seconds that felt like hours, adjusted for wind and elevation, and fired with the kind of confidence that could only come from months of preparation. The bullet struck home, and Maya heard something she had never heard before at FOB Granite, the sound of Marines cheering for her success. But the celebration was premature. She still had 2 targets remaining, and she could see in Hartwell's expression that he was preparing one final attempt to derail her performance. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Hartwell's voice boomed across the range, "I want to remind you that failure at this stage of the challenge carries significant consequences. Are you certain you want to continue?" Maya understood the threat implicit in his words. She was being offered a way out, a chance to withdraw from the challenge before completing it, which would allow Hartwell to claim that she had recognized her own limitations. But withdrawal would also mean accepting that the system was immutable, that change was impossible, that women like her would always be relegated to supporting roles, regardless of their capabilities. "Sir," Maya replied, her voice carrying across the desert with perfect military courtesy and absolute determination, "I intend to complete the challenge as specified." The 10th target appeared a complex scenario involving multiple threats at varying distances, requiring rapid target transitions and split-second decisions about engagement priorities. This was the sequence that had made Hartwell legendary, the moment where technical skill had to combine with tactical brilliance and unshakable nerve. Maya engaged the first threat at 200 meters, transitioned to the second at 300 meters, then back to a closer target at 150 meters that had emerged from concealment. Each shot was fired with mechanical precision, but Maya could feel something changing in her mental state. The pressure that had initially felt crushing was transforming into a kind of crystalline focus she had never experienced before. She fired the final shot of the 10th target sequence and immediately prepared for the 11th and final challenge, the shot that would either make history or validate every criticism that had been leveled against her capabilities. But as the final target began to rise, Maya heard something that made her blood freeze. Colonel Hartwell's radio crackled to life with an urgent message from base operations. a real emergency that required immediate attention from the commanding officer. All units, be advised we have incoming wounded from Checkpoint Delta, medical. Personnel to Trauma Bay, immediately. Colonel Hartwell to Operations Center, urgent. Maya watched in disbelief as Hartwell hesitated, clearly torn between responding to the emergency and maintaining his psychological campaign against her performance. For a moment, she thought he might actually abandon his duties to continue pressuring her, which would have been a dereliction that even his supporters couldn't defend. Master Sergeant Torres, Hartwell finally barked, maintain oversight of the challenge. I'll be monitoring from operations. He paused, fixing Maya with a stare that promised consequences regardless of her performance. Complete the challenge according to standard protocols. As Hartwell strode away from the firing line, Maya felt the psychological pressure shift but not disappear. She understood that her performance was now being observed and evaluated by Torres, whose professionalism was unquestioned, but whose loyalty to the chain of command was absolute. Any irregularities or failures would be reported with clinical precision. The 11th and final target rose from its concealment, a hostage scenario at maximum range, complicated by partial obstruction and the need for a precision shot that would test everything Maya had learned about marksmanship, tactics, and the kind of mental resilience that separated competent shooters from true masters of the craft. Maya studied the target through her scope, calculating wind speed, bullet drop, and the complex geometry required to place her shot within the narrow window that would constitute success. She had studied this exact scenario dozens of times, had practiced variations of it until the mechanics became instinctive, but she had never attempted it under conditions like these. The crowd behind her had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Maya could feel the weight of their attention, but more importantly, she could feel the presence of the women who were watching with desperate hope, who needed her to succeed not just for herself but for all of them. Maya's breathing slowed, her heart rate steadied, and the desert around her faded into insignificance. There was only the target, the rifle, and the shot that would define not just her career, but her understanding of who she was meant to become. She fired. The bullet traveled 400 meters in perfect silence, crossing the desert in a trajectory that seemed to bend reality itself. Maya watched through her scope as it struck the target with surgical precision, hitting the narrow zone that represented the difference between success and failure, between vindication and the validation of every prejudice that had tried to limit her potential. For a moment, the desert was absolutely silent. Then Master Sergeant Torres's voice cut through the stillness with professional precision and unmistakable admiration. Target eliminated. Challenge completed successfully. Accuracy rating, 94.7%. Maya had not just broken Colonel Hartwell's record, she had shattered it. The crowd erupted. Marines who had come to watch her fail were now cheering her success with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for major military victories. But Maya barely heard the celebration. She was focused on a single face in the crowd, the young female Marine who had pushed to the front, whose eyes were now bright with tears of joy and possibility. Maya realized that she had accomplished something larger than breaking a record. She had proven that excellence was not limited by gender, that capability could not be constrained by prejudice, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation was the one everyone had underestimated. But even as she savored the moment of triumph, Maya understood that this was only the beginning. Breaking Hartwell's record was significant, but the real challenge would be surviving the consequences of her success. The celebration that followed Maya's record-breaking performance was unlike anything Phobe Granite had witnessed during Colonel Hartwell's command. Marines who had spent years accepting the status quo suddenly found themselves cheering for change, their voices creating a cacophony that echoed across the desert like thunder after lightning. But Maya's triumph was interrupted by development. That would transform her victory from a personal achievement into something much more significant. As Master Sergeant Torres was documenting her final scores, his radio crackled with a message that made everyone within earshot freeze. Alpha Base to Granite Operations. Be advised, we have General Morrison and staff inbound for surprise inspection. 8:15 minutes. All units maintain current posture. Maya felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. General Patricia Morrison, the commanding general of the entire theater of operations, was arriving at FOB Granite in less than 15 minutes during the exact window when Maya's challenge had shattered every assumption about female combat capability. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Maya suspected that someone had informed higher headquarters about the challenge, probably hoping to document what they expected would be her failure. Instead, General Morrison would arrive to find a staff sergeant who had just rewritten the record books and a colonel whose legendary status had been publicly challenged. Torres approached Maya with an expression that mixed pride with concern. "Chun, I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "What just happened here goes way beyond base politics. General Morrison has been pushing integration initiatives that Colonel Hartwell has resisted. Your performance today is going to have implications that reach all the way to the Pentagon." Maya nodded, beginning to understand that her challenge had intersected with much larger forces than she had realized. The debate over women in combat roles wasn't just happening at FOB Granite, it was raging throughout the entire military structure, with careers and reputations hanging in the balance. "Gunny," Maya said, using the informal address that indicated trust and respect, "I need to know something. Did you expect me to succeed today?" Torres was quiet for a long moment, studying Maya with the intensity of someone trying to communicate something complex in simple words. "Chun, I've been in the Marines for 22 years. I've seen a lot of people claim they were ready for something they couldn't handle." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "But I've also seen what happens when genuine capability gets suppressed because it doesn't fit someone's preconceptions. Today, you proved that excellence comes in forms that some people refuse to recognize." Before Maya could respond, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. General Morrison's transport was arriving ahead of schedule, which meant the inspection would begin before anyone had time to prepare the usual sanitized version of reality that visiting dignitaries typically encountered. Maya watched as Colonel Hartwell emerged from the operations center, his expression a carefully controlled mask that couldn't quite hide his awareness that everything had changed. He began issuing rapid orders to his staff, clearly hoping to manage the narrative before General Morrison could witness the full scope of what had occurred. But Hartwell's attempt at damage control was interrupted by something unprecedented. Group of Marines, led by Lieutenant Rodriguez, who approached him with a request that bordered on insubordination. "Sir," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the kind of formal respect that masked deeper tensions, "the Marines would like General Morrison to witness a demonstration of Staff Sergeant Chen's marksmanship capabilities." Maya watched Hartwell's face cycle through emotions: surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear. He understood immediately that his Marines were no longer willing to pretend that Maya's achievement was somehow less significant than his own record. "Lieutenant," Hartwell's voice carried a warning that everyone present understood, "I don't think that's necessary. The General has more important matters to address during her visit." But Rodriguez pressed forward with the kind of courage that Maya recognized from her own decision to challenge the system. "Sir, with respect, Staff Sergeant Chen just achieved the highest marksmanship score in this unit's history. That seems like exactly the kind of combat readiness that General Morrison would want to evaluate." Maya realized that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when individual courage was transforming into collective action, when people who had accepted limitations for years were suddenly refusing to pretend that excellence was invisible. The helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash, and General Morrison emerged with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. Maya had never seen the general in person, but her reputation preceded her, a combat veteran who had risen through the ranks during an era when women faced barriers that made current challenges seem minor by comparison. General Morrison was accompanied by a small staff that included Colonel Sarah Henderson, the theater's operations officer, and Major James Park, whose role as Inspector General meant he was specifically tasked with evaluating unit readiness and leadership effectiveness. Maya watched as Colonel Hartwell approached the general with the kind of formal greeting that was designed to control the initial narrative of the inspection. But before he could launch into his prepared briefing, General Morrison's attention was drawn to the unusual scene on the firing range. "Colonel," General Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to command. "Respect, it appears your Marines are engaged in some kind of training exercise. I'd like to observe." Maya saw Hartwell's jaw tighten as he realized that his carefully planned inspection was about to become something entirely different. "Ma'am, we were just concluding some routine marksmanship training. Nothing that would warrant the general's attention." But General Morrison had already begun walking toward the firing range, her experienced eye taking in details that Hartwell clearly hoped she wouldn't notice: the unusual size of the assembled crowd, the sophisticated target configurations, and the unmistakable energy of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. Master Sergeant Torres approached the general with the kind of military bearing that indicated both respect and absolute honesty. "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Chen has just completed Colonel Hartwell's marksmanship challenge with a score of 94.7%. Maya watched General Morrison's eyebrows rise slightly, the only outward sign that she understood the significance of what Torres had just reported. Hartwell's record was legendary throughout the theater, and Morrison would have known immediately that breaking it was an achievement of extraordinary magnitude. "Staff Sergeant Chen," General Morrison said, turning her attention to Maya for the Maya Fungfa. "First time, step forward." Maya approached with textbook military bearing, but she could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. This was the moment that would determine whether her achievement would be recognized and celebrated, or minimized and forgotten. "Ma'am," Maya said, executing a perfect salute. General Morrison returned the salute, then studied Maya with the intensity of someone who had spent decades evaluating military personnel. "Tell me about your background, Staff Sergeant. What's your military occupational specialty?" "Ma'am, I'm a logistics specialist with cross-training in combat operations." "And your marksmanship experience?" Maya hesitated, aware that her answer would either validate or undermine everything that had just occurred. "Ma'am, I've maintained expert qualification throughout my enlistment, with additional training provided by Master Sergeant Torres." "General." Morrison turned to Torres, her expression indicating that she wanted more information. "Master Sergeant, explain the nature of this challenge and the conditions under which it was completed." Torres provided a detailed briefing that included not just the technical specifications of the challenge, but also the psychological pressure that Hartwell had imposed through his commentary and his invocation of the combat stress provision. Maya watched the general's expression grow increasingly serious as she understood the full scope of what had occurred. "Colonel Hartwell," General Morrison's voice carried a tone that Maya had never heard directed at her commanding officer, formal, professional, but with an undercurrent that suggested serious consequences were being considered. "I'd like to understand your assessment of Staff Sergeant Chen's performance." Maya watched Hartwell struggle to find a response that would minimize her achievement without appearing to criticize his own Marines. "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Chen performed adequately under the specific conditions of today's exercise." The word "adequately" hung in the desert air like a challenge. Maya realized that Hartwell was still trying to diminish her achievement, even in front of a general who clearly understood the significance of what had occurred. But General Morrison wasn't finished. "Master Sergeant Torres, in your professional Opinion: how would you characterize Staff Sergeant Chen's performance? Torres didn't hesitate. Ma'am, it was the most impressive display of marksmanship I've witnessed in 22 years of military service. Staff Sergeant Chen demonstrated not just technical excellence, but the kind of mental resilience and tactical innovation that defines our finest Marines. Maya felt a surge of gratitude toward Torres, whose honest assessment was providing General Morrison with the information she needed to understand the true significance of what had occurred. General Morrison turned back to Maya, her expression thoughtful. Staff Sergeant, what are your career goals? The question was loaded with implications that Maya understood immediately. Her answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially the opportunities available to women throughout the theater. Ma'am, I joined the Marines to serve in whatever capacity would best contribute to our mission. I believe my skills and training could be most effectively utilized in combat operations. And Colonel Hartwell, what's your assessment of staff Sergeant Chen's readiness for combat roles? Maya watched her commanding officer struggle with a question that would define his leadership legacy. His answer would either validate years of discriminatory practices or acknowledge that his assumptions had been fundamentally wrong. Ma'am, Hartwell said carefully, Staff Sergeant Chen has demonstrated competence in logistics operations. The non-answer was so obvious that even Hartwell seemed to realize how inadequate it sounded. General Morrison's expression made it clear that she understood exactly what was happening. A commanding officer who was unable to acknowledge excellence when it challenged his preconceptions. But General Morrison had one more question that would change everything. Colonel Henderson, she said, addressing her operations officer, what's the current status of combat integration assessments in this theater? Colonel Henderson stepped forward with a briefing folder that Maya suspected contained information that would have significant implications for everyone present. Ma'am, we've been directed by Pentagon leadership to identify and develop personnel who demonstrate exceptional capability regardless of traditional role assignments. Maya realized that her challenge had intersected with much larger policy initiatives than she had understood. The Pentagon was actively seeking to identify and promote capable personnel, which meant her achievement would be evaluated within a framework that valued excellence over convention. General Morrison turned back to Maya one final time. Staff Sergeant Chen, I'm going to make you an offer. My staff is implementing a new program designed to identify and develop exceptional talent throughout the theater. Based on what I've witnessed today, I believe you would be an ideal candidate for immediate assignment to a forward combat unit. Maya felt the desert spinning around her as she realized that her moment of triumph was becoming something much larger, an opportunity to achieve the goals that had brought her into the Marines 6 years earlier. But she also understood that accepting General Morrison's offer would mean leaving FOB Granite, leaving the support system that Torres and Rodriguez had provided, and entering an environment where her success would be scrutinized and challenged by people who had invested their careers in proving that integration couldn't work. Ma'am, Maya said, I would be honored to serve wherever the Corps believes I can be most effective. General Morrison nodded, then turned to address the assembled Marines who had witnessed Maya's achievement. What I've seen here today represents exactly the kind of excellence that will define our future success. Staff Sergeant Chen has demonstrated that capability exists wherever we're willing to recognize and develop it. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. But I've also seen evidence of leadership that fails to recognize excellence when it challenges conventional assumptions. That's a problem we will address. Maya understood that General Morrison's words carried implications that reached far beyond her own situation. Colonel Hartwell's career was now under scrutiny, and the entire command structure at FOB Granite would be evaluated based on how effectively they developed and utilized the talents of all their personnel. As General Morrison and her staff prepared to continue their inspection, Maya found herself surrounded by Marines who wanted to congratulate her success. But the person she was most grateful to see was Lieutenant Rodriguez, whose eyes shone with the kind of hope that comes from witnessing the impossible become real. "You did it," Rodriguez said quietly. "You actually did it." Maya nodded, but she was already thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. Breaking Hartwell's record was significant, but using that achievement to create lasting change would require everything she had learned about courage, persistence, and the kind of strategic thinking that could transform individual success into systemic reform. The desert sun was reaching its peak, but Maya felt as though she was finally emerging from a long darkness into the possibility of becoming exactly who she had always known she was meant to be. 3 months after Maya's record-breaking performance, FOB granite looked almost identical to the outside observer, but anyone who had witnessed that day in the desert could feel the fundamental changes that were rippling through the command structure. Like seismic shifts in bedrock, Maya was no longer at FOB granite. General Morrison had made good on her promise, transferring Maya to the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, where her skills were being developed in ways that Colonel Hartwell had never imagined possible. But the effects of her achievement continued to transform the base she had left behind, creating opportunities and challenges that no one had anticipated. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez stood in the same supply depot where Maya had spent 3 years, proving her competence while dreaming of something larger. But Rodriguez was no longer relegated to administrative duties. She was preparing for her own assignment to a forward combat unit, part of the integration program that Maya's success had helped accelerate throughout the theater. The changes hadn't come without cost. Colonel Hartwell had been relieved of command 6 weeks after General Morrison's inspection, transferred to a staff position at headquarters where his conventional thinking would be less likely to stifle the kind of innovation the Corps was trying to cultivate. His replacement, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, had arrived with a mandate to implement the integration policies that were reshaping military culture across all branches of service. But perhaps the most significant change was visible in the culture across all branches of service. Faces of the Marines who had witnessed Maya's triumph, the women who served at FOB Granite, no longer carried themselves with the careful invisibility that had been necessary under Hartwell's command. They walked with the confidence of people who knew that excellence would be recognized and rewarded, regardless of their gender. Master Sergeant Torres had been promoted to first sergeant and given responsibility for implementing the new training protocols that were designed to identify and develop capability wherever it existed. He had become something of a legend himself, the NCO who had recognized Maya's potential and provided the guidance that made her success possible. The thing about excellence, Torres told the group of young Marines he was training in advanced marksmanship, is that it's not limited by anyone else's assumptions about what you're capable of achieving. Staff Sergeant Chen proved that 3 months ago, but the real lesson isn't about her individual success. It's about what becomes possible when we stop limiting ourselves to other people's expectations. The training program Torres had developed was unlike anything the Marines had seen before. It focused not just on technical skills, but on the mental resilience and tactical innovation that had made Maya's performance so extraordinary. Marines of all backgrounds were being challenged to exceed their own assumptions about their capabilities, and the results were transforming unit readiness in ways that were being studied throughout the Corps. Maya herself had become something of a legend, but she was too busy with her new assignment to spend much time reflecting on her celebrity status. The 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion operated in the most challenging environments the military had to offer, and Maya found herself tested in ways that made her breakthrough at FOB Granite seem like preparation for the real challenges of combat. Leadership. Her first mission with the reconnaissance unit had been a complex intelligence gathering operation in mountainous terrain that required the kind of precision shooting she had demonstrated during her record-breaking performance. But it also required leadership skills, tactical decision-making, and the ability to function effectively as part of a team that initially viewed her arrival with skepticism. Maya had won over her new unit, the same way she had impressed the Marines. At FOB, Granite through consistent excellence and the kind of professional competence that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Within weeks, she had become an integral part of operations that were contributing to strategic objectives throughout the theater. But Maya's success was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond her individual achievements. Women throughout the military were using her example as proof that barriers could be overcome, that excellence could not be constrained by prejudice, and that the military was capable of recognizing and rewarding merit regardless of conventional assumptions. The Pentagon had begun studying Maya's case as part of a larger evaluation of integration policies, and her performance data was being used to support arguments for expanded opportunities throughout all branches of service. Congressional hearings had been held, policy papers had been written, and Maya's record-breaking achievement had become evidence in debates that would shape military culture for generations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 6 months after Maya's transfer, she received a letter that had been forwarded through multiple command levels before reaching her current assignment. The return address indicated it was from Colonel James Hartwell, now serving in a staff position at Marine Corps headquarters. Maya opened the letter with curiosity and caution, unsure what her former commanding officer might want to communicate. What she found was an apology that was remarkable for its honesty and its recognition of the damage that prejudice could inflict on military readiness. Staff Sergeant Chen. The letter began, "I have spent considerable time reflecting on your performance and my response to it. I want you to know that I was wrong, not just about your individual capabilities, but about the assumptions that guided my leadership for over 20 years. Your achievement at FOB, Granite, forced me to confront the reality that I had been limiting the effectiveness of my command by failing to recognize and develop the talents of all Marines under my supervision. That recognition has been painful, but it has also been necessary. I hope you understand that my resistance to your success was never personal. It was the result of conventional thinking that confused tradition with effectiveness, that prioritized comfort over excellence. Your performance proved that the military is strongest when it embraces capability wherever it exists. I wanted you to know that I have been working with Pentagon leadership to develop training programs that will help other commanders avoid the mistakes I made. Your example is being used to demonstrate what becomes possible when we stop limiting ourselves to outdated assumptions. I wish you continued success in your service, and I thank you for teaching me something essential about leadership and excellence. Respectfully, Colonel James Hartwell. Maya read the letter twice, trying to process the implications of such a comprehensive acknowledgement of error from someone who had wielded absolute authority over her career. She realized that Hartwell's apology represented something larger than personal reconciliation. It was evidence that the military institution was capable of recognizing its mistakes and implementing changes that would prevent similar problems in the future. But Maya's story was still being written. Her success with the reconnaissance unit had led to another offer that would test her capabilities in ways that even her breakthrough at FOB Granite hadn't prepared her for. She had been selected for officer candidate school with the possibility of eventually commanding the kinds of units where her own excellence had been systematically discouraged. The irony wasn't lost on her. Maya Chen, who had been dismissed as support staff by Colonel Hartwell, was being groomed for leadership positions that would give her the authority to ensure that other women wouldn't face the barriers that had nearly derailed her own career. 1 year after her record-breaking performance, Maya returned to FOB Granite as a newly commissioned second lieutenant, assigned to evaluate the implementation of the integration policies that her achievement had helped inspire. Walking across the same desert where she had shattered assumptions about female combat capability, Maya felt the weight of how much had changed and how much work remained to be done. Lieutenant Colonel Santos met Maya at the airfield, her expression indicating both professional respect and personal appreciation for what Maya's success had made possible. "Lieutenant Chen," Santos said, "welcome back to Granite. I think you'll find it's a very different place from the one you left." Maya nodded, already seeing evidence of the changes in the confident bearing of the female Marines she observed around the base. But she also understood that lasting change would require continued vigilance, that the progress they had achieved could be reversed if future leaders failed to maintain the commitment to excellence over convention. That evening, Maya found herself standing on the same firing range where she had changed everything. Master Sergeant Torres joined her, both of them looking out at the desert that had witnessed a transformation neither of them had fully anticipated. "You know what the most important thing is?" Torres asked, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had helped make the impossible become real. "What's that, First Sergeant?" "The young Marines coming up now don't think what you did was extraordinary. To them, it's just what Marines do. They find ways to excel regardless of the obstacles." Torres paused, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "That's when you know real change has happened, when excellence stops being surprising and starts being expected." Maya smiled, understanding exactly what Torres meant. Her record-breaking performance had been significant, not just for what it achieved in the moment, but for what it had made seem normal and achievable for everyone who came after. 2 years later, Maya was commanding her own reconnaissance unit, leading Marines in operations that required the same combination of technical excellence and mental resilience that had made her famous. But more importantly, she was mentoring young Marines who saw her success not as an exception to be admired, but as a standard to be exceeded. The military had changed, not just in its policies, but in its understanding of what excellence looked like and where it could be found. Maya's achievement had become part of a larger transformation that was making the institution stronger, more effective, and more representative of the values it existed to defend. But Maya understood that her real legacy wasn't the record she had broken or the barriers she had overcome. It was visible in the confidence of the young women who served under her command, in their assumption that capability would be recognized and rewarded, in their determination to exceed not just the expectations of others, but their own understanding of what they could achieve. The desert wind that had witnessed Maya's triumph continued to blow across Fob Granite, carrying with it the promise that excellence, once unleashed, would never again be contained by the artificial limitations that had once seemed insurmountable. 5 years had passed since the desert morning when Staff Sergeant Maya Chen had shattered more than just a marksmanship record. The ripples from that single day had spread far beyond Fob Granite, transforming military culture in ways that policy papers and congressional mandates had never managed to achieve. Major Maya Chen stood before the graduating class of Marine Corps Officer Candidate School, her uniform bearing decorations that told the story of a career that had exceeded every expectation, including her own. The combat action ribbon spoke of missions in the most challenging environments the Corps had to offer. The Bronze Star with V device recognized tactical leadership under fire. The Meritorious Service Medal acknowledged her role in developing training programs that were reshaping how the military identified and cultivated excellence. But the decoration Maya treasured most was the one that told the story of that day in the desert, the expert marksmanship badge that had been specially engraved with the date and location of her record-breaking performance. It wasn't an official recognition, but rather a gift from the Marines who had witnessed her achievement and understood its significance. Excellence, Maya told the assembled officer candidates, is not a destination you arrive at once and then inhabit forever. It's a standard you choose to pursue every single day, especially when that pursuit requires you to challenge assumptions that have never been questioned before. In the audience, Maya could see faces that reflected the change her achievement had helped create. The graduating class was more diverse than any in Marine Corps history, not because standards had been lowered, But because barriers had been removed and potential had been unleashed wherever it existed, among the graduates sat Second Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, whose own journey from administrative duties to combat leadership had been made possible by the precedent Maya had established. Rodriguez had distinguished herself during officer candidate school with the same combination of technical excellence and tactical innovation that had made Maya's performance so remarkable. But perhaps the most significant change was visible in the instructor cadre that had trained these new officers. Colonel Maria Santos, Maya's former commanding officer at FOB Granite, had been promoted to oversee officer training throughout the Marine Corps. Her mandate was to ensure that future military leaders would recognize and develop capability wherever they found it, regardless of their own preconceptions. Master Sergeant Torres, now Sergeant Major Torres, had become legendary within the Corps for his ability to identify potential in Marines who had been overlooked by conventional assessment methods. His training programs were being implemented at bases throughout the world, and his techniques for developing mental resilience under pressure had become standard curriculum. Even Colonel James Hartwell had found a role in the transformation his resistance had inadvertently helped catalyze. His honest assessment of his own limitations and his commitment to preventing similar mistakes had made him an unexpected advocate for the integration policies he had once opposed. He was now working with Pentagon leadership to develop leadership training that specifically addressed the unconscious biases that could limit unit effectiveness. But Maya's story had expanded far beyond military circles. Her achievement had been featured in documentaries, studied in university leadership courses, and cited in congressional testimony about the importance of maximizing human potential in all institutions. She had become a symbol of what was possible when excellence was allowed to flourish, regardless of conventional limitations. 10 years after her record-breaking performance, Lieutenant Colonel Maya Chen returned to Afghanistan as part of a congressional delegation evaluating the effectiveness of integration policies. Standing once again on the desert that had witnessed her transformation from underestimated logistics specialist to recognized military leader, Maya reflected on how much had changed and how much remained constant. FOB Granite was now commanded by Colonel Jennifer Park, a combat veteran whose own career had been accelerated by the precedent Maya had established. The base that had once been a symbol of institutional resistance to change had become a model for how military organizations could evolve to maximize their effectiveness. But more importantly, the young Marines serving at FOB Granite carried themselves with the confidence of people who knew that their potential would be recognized and developed based on merit rather than prejudice. They trained with the expectation that excellence would be rewarded, that barriers existed to be overcome, and that their individual achievements could contribute to larger transformations. Maya walked through the base that had once constrained her ambitions, now seeing it through the eyes of someone who understood how institutional change actually occurred. It wasn't through grand gestures or policy pronouncements, but through the accumulated effect of individual acts of courage that gradually shifted what seemed possible. In the supply depot where she had once processed requisitions while dreaming of combat assignments, Maya found a group of young Marines engaged in advanced tactical training. Their instructor, Staff Sergeant Lisa Williams, was teaching the same principles of mental resilience and technical precision that Torres had shared with Maya in those pre-dawn training sessions years earlier. The most important thing to understand, Williams was telling her students, is that records exist to be broken. Every limitation you accept becomes a ceiling on what you can achieve. Excellence means constantly pushing beyond what you thought was possible. Maya smiled, recognizing her own philosophy reflected in Williams's teaching. But she also understood that the transformation was now self-sustaining, that each generation of Marines would carry forward the lessons learned by their predecessors, while discovering new ways to exceed expectations. 15 years after that day in the desert, Maya had achieved the rank of colonel and was serving as commanding officer of the Marine Corps' Training and Education Command. Her mission was to ensure that every Marine, regardless of their background or specialty, received the kind of development that would maximize their potential and contribute to overall readiness. But Maya's most important role was as a mentor to the young women who saw in her example proof that barriers could be overcome and dreams could be achieved. She received letters from Marines stationed around the world, asking for advice about how to navigate challenges that seemed insurmountable, how to maintain confidence in the face of skepticism, how to transform individual excellence into lasting change. Maya's responses to these letters always emphasized the same themes. Excellence was available to anyone willing to pursue it relentlessly. Change occurred through consistent action rather than dramatic gestures. And the most important thing was not to exceed other people's expectations, but to refuse to limit yourself to their assumptions. 20 years after her record-breaking performance, General Maya Chen stood before a joint session of Congress, testifying about the military's progress in developing human potential and maximizing organizational effectiveness. Her uniform bore the stars of general rank, but Maya knew that her real authority came from the example she had set and the precedent she had established. What we learned from the integration initiatives of the past 2 decades, Maya told the assembled representatives and senators, is that excellence has no demographic profile. It exists wherever we're willing to recognize and develop it. Our military is stronger today, not because we lowered standards, but because we removed artificial barriers that prevented us from utilizing all available talent. In the gallery overlooking the congressional chamber, Maya could see familiar faces from her journey. Torres, now retired, but serving as a consultant on leadership development. Rodriguez, now a general herself and serving as Deputy Commanding General of Marine Corps Combat Development. Santos, recently appointed as the first female commandant of the Marine Corps, but Maya was most moved to see Carmen Chun, her mother, sitting in the front row with tears of pride streaming down her face. Carmen had lived long enough to see her daughter's impossible dream become a reality that had transformed not just Maya's life, but the institution she had chosen to serve. As Maya concluded her testimony, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a narrow bunk at FOB Granite to the halls of Congress. The path had been longer and more complex than anything she could have imagined that morning when she had decided to challenge Colonel Hartwell's record. But Maya understood now that breaking the record had never been the real goal. The marksmanship achievement had been a means to a larger end, proving that excellence could not be constrained by prejudice, that institutions could evolve when individual courage forced them to confront their limitations, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not against external enemies, but against internal barriers that prevented people from becoming who they were meant to be. 20-5 years after that transformative day in the Afghan desert, Maya's story had become part of military folklore, studied in leadership courses and cited in policy discussions throughout the Department of Defense. But the real measure of her impact was visible in the confidence of young Marines who took for granted opportunities that previous generations had been denied. The military had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to Colonel Hartwell when he first assumed command of FOB Granite. Women served in combat roles as a matter of course, their capabilities evaluated on merit rather than assumptions. The integration that had once seemed impossible had become so complete that it was no longer remarkable, but Maya's legacy extended far beyond military circles. Her story had inspired changes in corporate leadership, academic institutions, and government agencies that had recognized the importance of maximizing human potential rather than limiting it based on conventional assumptions. Books had been written, documentaries had been produced, and leadership programs had been developed based on the principles she had demonstrated. Maya herself had retired from active duty 5 years earlier, but her influence continued through The Maya Chen Leadership Institute, a program she had established to develop emerging leaders who demonstrated the same combination of technical excellence and moral courage that had made her own success possible. The institute operated from a facility built on land donated by the Marine Corps, not far from the desert where Maya had changed everything. Students came from all branches of the military, from corporate leadership programs, and from non-profit organizations that were working to create positive change in their communities. But the program that Maya was most proud of was the one that brought young women from disadvantaged backgrounds to the Institute for Intensive Leadership Development. These students often arrived with raw potential that had been overlooked or dismissed by conventional educational systems, but they left with the confidence and skills necessary to exceed every expectation that had been placed on their capabilities. On the 30th anniversary of her record-breaking performance, Maya returned to the site of her triumph one final time. The desert had changed. Phobe granite had been decommissioned years earlier, returned to the Afghan government as part of the withdrawal that had ended America's longest war. But the landscape remained essentially the same, still marked by the kind of harsh beauty that had witnessed her transformation from support staff to military legend. Maya was not alone for this pilgrimage. She was accompanied by a group that represented every phase of her journey. Torres, now in his 80s but still sharp as the day he had first recognized her potential. Rodriguez, preparing for her own retirement after a distinguished career in military leadership. Santos, who had served 2 terms as commandant and was now working on her memoirs. And dozens of other Marines whose lives had been changed by the precedent Maya had established. But the person Maya was most grateful to have present was Carmen Chun, now 92 years old and still fierce with the pride that had sustained her through decades of worry about her daughter's dangerous chosen profession. Carmen had lived to see Maya's impossible dream become a reality that had transformed not just the military, but society's understanding of what was possible when artificial barriers were removed. As the sun set over the Afghan desert, painting the landscape in the same colors Maya remembered from that transformative morning 30 years earlier, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a logistics specialist who dreamed of combat assignments to a general whose influence had shaped military culture for an entire generation. The young Marines who served today would never fully understand how difficult the path had been, how many barriers had needed to be overcome, how much courage had been required to challenge systems that had seemed immutable. To them, Maya's achievement was simply history, a story about obstacles that had been surmounted before they were born. But Maya understood that this was exactly how progress worked, through individual acts of courage that gradually shifted what seemed possible, until future generations inherited a world where excellence was recognized and rewarded, regardless of the forms it took. As the desert wind carried the last light of day across the landscape that had witnessed her triumph, Maya felt a profound sense of completion. She had become exactly who she was meant to be, had used her gifts to create opportunities for others, and had proved that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept limitations that others assume are permanent. The desert had kept her secrets for 30 years, but now those secrets had become part of history, woven into the fabric of an institution that had learned to recognize excellence wherever it appeared. Maya's record had long since been broken by other Marines who had built on the foundation she had established, but the precedent she had set, that capability could not be constrained by prejudice, remained as relevant as ever, standing in the place where she had changed everything, surrounded by people whose lives had been transformed by her courage. Maya understood that she had achieved something more valuable than any individual recognition or career milestone. She had proved that excellence, once unleashed, could never be contained by the artificial limitations that had once seemed insurmountable. The stars began to appear in the darkening Afghan sky, the same stars that had watched over her during those pre-dawn training sessions. when she had prepared for a challenge that would define not just her own future, but the opportunities available to everyone who came after her. Maya smiled, knowing that somewhere in the world, another young woman was probably staring at those same stars and dreaming of breaking barriers that others insisted were permanent. The desert wind whispered across the sand, carrying with it the promise that excellence, once recognized, would never again be limited by the assumptions of people who confused tradition with truth. Maya Chen had changed everything. But more importantly, she had proved that everything could be changed by people who refused to accept that limitations were permanent, who understood that records existed to be broken, and who had the courage to become exactly who they were meant to be. The legacy would continue, carried forward by Marines who saw her example not as extraordinary, but as proof of what became possible when excellence was allowed to flourish without artificial constraints. The desert had witnessed a transformation that extended far beyond military culture, touching every institution that had learned from Maya's example that human potential could not be maximized until artificial barriers were removed. As the group prepared to leave the desert that had changed their lives, Maya took one final look at the landscape that had witnessed her triumph. Tomorrow she would return to her work developing the next generation of leaders, but tonight she allowed herself to savor the satisfaction of a promise kept to her 17-year-old self, who had chosen the harder path because it led to becoming who she was meant to be. The wind carried her memories across the desert, but it also carried her legacy forward into a future where young women would inherit opportunities that previous generations had been forced to create through individual acts of extraordinary courage. Maya Chen had shattered Colonel Hartwell's record 30 years earlier, but her real achievement was proving that some things, once broken, could never be put back together, and that sometimes that was exactly what the world needed. The desert stars shone down on empty sand, but they illuminated a legacy that would inspire excellence for generations to come. 40 years after Maya Chen first gripped that M4 rifle in the Afghan desert, the Marine Corps had evolved into an organization that would have been unrecognizable to Colonel Hartwell and the institutional barriers he had once represented. The changes that Maya's courage had catalyzed had spread far beyond military culture, influencing leadership development, organizational effectiveness, and society's understanding of human potential across every sector of American life. But the most significant measure of Maya's impact was visible in the confident bearing of Marines who had never questioned whether excellence could emerge from unexpected sources. To them, the idea that someone might be dismissed as support staff, based on gender rather than capability, seemed as antiquated as using horses in combat. Captain Jennifer Martinez stood on the same desert training ground where Maya had made history, but she was conducting a very different kind of demonstration. As the commanding officer of the Marine Corps' Elite Force Reconnaissance Unit, Martinez was showcasing tactical innovations that built on the precedent Maya had established, proving that excellence continued to evolve when institutions remained committed to recognizing and developing human potential. Martinez's unit reflected the complete integration that Maya's breakthrough had helped achieve. Her Marines included men and women from every demographic background imaginable, unified not by similarity, but by their shared commitment to exceeding every standard, breaking every barrier, and redefining what was possible in modern warfare. Most important lesson we learned from General Chen's example, Martinez told the group of foreign military observers who had come to study American integration policies, is that excellence has no demographic profile. Our job is to create conditions where capability can flourish wherever it exists, then develop that capability to its maximum potential. The foreign officers representing militaries that were still struggling with their own integration challenges took careful notes as Martinez's Marines demonstrated tactical procedures that had been refined through decades of diverse leadership. What they were witnessing was not just successful integration, but transformation into something more effective than what had existed before. Dr. Sarah Kim, a research psychologist who had spent 15 years studying the long-term effects of Maya's breakthrough, was present to document how institutional change had been sustained across multiple generations of leadership. Her research had shown that organizations that successfully removed artificial barriers didn't just become more inclusive, they became more innovative, more adaptable, and more effective at achieving their fundamental missions. What makes the Maya Chen case study so significant, Dr. Kim explained to the assembled observers, is that it demonstrates how individual acts of courage can create systemic change that becomes self-reinforcing. Each generation builds on the precedent established by their predecessors, gradually expanding what seems possible. But the most powerful testimony came from the Marines themselves, who spoke about their experiences with the matter-of-fact confidence of people who had never doubted that they belonged exactly where they were. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the daughter of Maya's former commanding officer, had inherited her mother's commitment to excellence and her determination to develop potential wherever she found it. She had spent her career in the most challenging assignments the Corps offered, earning decorations that spoke of tactical leadership under the most demanding conditions. "I grew up hearing stories about General Chen," Santos told the assembled observers. "But to my generation, those stories weren't about overcoming impossible barriers. They were about what Marines do when they're committed to excellence. The barriers that seemed insurmountable to previous generations were simply not part of our reality." The visiting officers were particularly interested in understanding how the changes had been sustained across multiple leadership transitions, how institutional culture had evolved to prevent regression to earlier patterns of exclusion and limitation. Colonel Michael Torres, the son of Maya's original mentor, had built his career on developing training programs that identified and cultivated capability regardless of its source. His approach combined the technical expertise his father had, demonstrated with innovations in psychological assessment that could predict success in ways that traditional methods had missed. "The key insight from the Chen legacy," Colonel Torres explained, "is that excellence is not a finite resource that must be rationed among preferred demographics. When you create systems that recognize and develop capability wherever it exists, you don't diminish existing excellence, you multiply it." The demonstration continued with tactical exercises that showcased the kind of innovation that emerged when diverse perspectives were integrated into decision-making processes. The Marines displayed coordination and adaptability that impressed even seasoned military observers who had seen elite units from around the world. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Captain Martinez was asked about the challenges her unit faced, whether integration had created any compromises in effectiveness or readiness. The question assumes that diversity represents a departure from some ideal standard. Martinez replied with the kind of directness that Maya would have recognized and appreciated. "But our effectiveness metrics show that units with diverse leadership consistently outperform homogeneous units across every measure we use. The compromise would be accepting artificial limitations on who can contribute to our mission." The foreign observers exchanged glances, clearly grappling with implications that challenged their own institutional assumptions. They were witnessing not just successful integration, but evidence that their own militaries might be operating below their potential by maintaining barriers that limited access to available talent. As the demonstration concluded, Dr. Kim presented data that quantified the long-term effects of Maya's breakthrough. Military effectiveness had improved across every measurable category. Leadership development had accelerated as organizations learned to recognize potential in forms they had previously overlooked. Innovation had increased as diverse perspectives contributed to tactical and strategic thinking. But the most significant finding was cultural. The Marine Corps had evolved into an organization where excellence was expected from everyone, where barriers to achievement were systematically identified and removed, where individual potential was developed to its maximum extent regardless of conventional limitations. The Chen effect, as Dr. Kim's research had labeled it, had influenced far more than military culture. Corporate leadership programs now included modules on recognizing and developing unexpected talent. Educational institutions had reformed admission and development policies to identify potential that traditional assessments missed. Government agencies had restructured promotion systems to ensure that capability rather than convention determined advancement opportunities. But the most powerful evidence of lasting change was visible in the confidence and competence of young people who took for granted opportunities that previous generations had been forced to create through extraordinary acts of individual courage. Lieutenant Alexandra Thompson, a recent graduate of the Naval Academy who had been assigned to Martinez's unit, represented the generation that had inherited Maya's legacy without having to fight for it. Her assumption that excellence would be recognized and rewarded regardless of its source reflected institutional changes that had become so complete they were no longer remarkable. "I've studied General Chen's story, obviously," Thompson said when asked about Maya's influence on her career decision. "But to be honest, it's hard for me to imagine a world where someone's potential would be limited by anything other than their own commitment to excellence. That world seems as foreign to me as segregated units must seem to General Chen." The comment sparked reflection among the older Marines present, who remembered when Maya's achievement had seemed revolutionary rather than representative of normal institutional function. They had witnessed a transformation that was so complete that its significance was difficult for younger generations to fully appreciate. As the demonstration concluded, the visiting foreign officers prepared to return to their own countries with evidence that successful integration was not just morally necessary but strategically advantageous. They had seen proof that organizations became more effective, not less, when they removed artificial barriers to excellence. But the most lasting impact of their visit might have been personal. Each officer had witnessed capabilities that challenged their own assumptions about human potential, had seen evidence that their own institutions might be operating below their true effectiveness by maintaining limitations that served no strategic purpose. Captain Martinez concluded the presentation with remarks that Maya herself might have made 4 decades earlier, when she was challenging assumptions that seemed immutable to everyone, except those brave enough to test their validity. "Excellence," Martinez told the assembled observers, "is not a privilege to be granted by those in authority. It's a capability that exists wherever people are willing to pursue it relentlessly. Our job as leaders is not to determine who deserves opportunities, but to create conditions where potential can flourish regardless of the forms it takes." The desert wind that had witnessed Maya's original triumph continued to blow across the training ground, carrying with it the promise that excellence, once unleashed, would continue to evolve and expand in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. But the most significant legacy was visible in the assumption, shared by every Marine present, that barriers existed to be overcome, that records existed to be broken, and that the most important question was not whether change was possible, but how quickly it could be achieved. Maya Chen had shattered more than Colonel Hartwell's marksmanship record 40 years earlier. She had shattered the assumptions that limited human potential, proving that excellence could not be constrained by prejudice, and that institutions could evolve when individual courage forced them to confront their limitations. The transformation was now so complete that it was difficult to imagine that things had ever been different. But in quiet moments, when the desert wind carried memories across the landscape that had witnessed Maya's triumph, older Marines remembered the courage it had taken to change everything, and younger Marines inherited the confidence that everything could be changed by people who refused to accept that limitations were permanent. The legacy continued, carried forward by Marines who understood that excellence, once recognized and developed, could never be contained by artificial barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Maya's record had been broken many times over the intervening decades, but her precedent, that capability could not be constrained by prejudice, remained as relevant and revolutionary as ever. 50 years had passed since Maya Chen first stood on that firing line in Afghanistan, and the world had transformed in ways that even her extraordinary vision could never have anticipated. The military that had once constrained her potential had evolved into an organization that actively sought and developed excellence wherever it appeared, understanding that human capability was too valuable to be limited by conventional assumptions. But the most profound changes were not institutional, they were personal. Maya, now in her 80s, had lived to see dreams that seemed impossible become realities that subsequent generations took for granted. The barriers that had required extraordinary courage to overcome had been so thoroughly dismantled that young people could barely comprehend that they had ever existed. Maya returned to Afghanistan one final time, not as an active duty Marine or a congressional representative, but as an elderly woman who wanted to stand once more in the place where she had changed everything. The country had evolved since her departure decades earlier, finding its own path towards stability and prosperity after decades of conflict. Granite was now a school, the Maya Chen Leadership Academy, where young Afghans learned about management, technology, and the kind of strategic thinking that could help their country continue its development. The firing range where Maya had made history was now a garden, carefully tended by students who probably knew little about what had occurred there half a century earlier, but Maya wasn't alone for this final pilgrimage. She was accompanied by Carmen, now 98 years old and still fierce with the pride that had sustained her through decades of worrying about her daughter's impossible dreams. Carmen had outlived everyone's expectations, determined to witness the complete fulfillment of the potential she had recognized in her daughter, even when she couldn't understand the path Maya had chosen to develop it. "Mia," Carmen said as they stood together in the garden that had been created where the firing range once existed, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't taken that shot?" Maya considered the question, thinking about the ripple effects that had spread from that single moment of courage. The military leaders who had been inspired by her example, the institutional changes that had emerged from her precedent, the young women who had inherited opportunities they had never needed to create through individual acts of extraordinary bravery. "I think someone else would have done it," Maya replied finally. "Maybe not that day, maybe not in the same way, but change was coming whether I was ready or not. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to help it along." Carmen smiled, recognizing in her daughter's response the wisdom that came from understanding how progress actually worked, not through the actions of solitary heroes, but through the accumulated courage of people who refused to accept limitations that served no purpose other than maintaining comfort for those who benefited from the status quo. As they walked through the academy that had been built on the foundation of Maya's achievement, they encountered students who represented the future that Maya's courage had helped create. Young women studying engineering, computer science, and business administration with the confidence of people who had never doubted that their potential would be recognized and developed. But Maya was most moved by a conversation with Fatima Ahmad, the Academy's director, who had built her career on the principle that excellence could not be constrained by conventional limitations. Ahmad had never heard Maya's story in detail, but she had built her life on the assumptions that Maya's courage had helped establish, that barriers existed to be overcome, that capability should be developed wherever it appeared, and that human potential was too valuable to be wasted on arbitrary restrictions. "The students here," Ahmed explained as she showed Maya and Carmen through the facilities, "don't think of themselves as pioneers or barrier breakers. They simply assume that their abilities will be recognized and developed, that their contributions will be valued, that their dreams are achievable if they're willing to work for them." Maya nodded, understanding that this was exactly how lasting change looked, not like revolution, But like young people who took for granted opportunities that previous generations had been forced to create through extraordinary acts of individual courage. As the day drew to a close, Maya found herself standing in the exact spot where she had fired the shot that changed everything. The physical markers were gone, the targets, the firing line, the observation area where 500 Marines had witnessed her triumph. But the significance of the place remained, embedded in the landscape like sediment that would endure long. After surface changes had transformed the visible world, Carmen took her daughter's hand, both women thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened teenager who had chosen a dangerous path because it led toward becoming who she was meant to be. The worried mother who had learned to support dreams she couldn't fully understand. The institution that had resisted change until individual courage forced it to confront its own limitations. Was it worth it? Carmen asked, the question she had carried for 50 years, finally finding voice. Maya looked around at the academy that had been built where barriers had once seemed insurmountable. At the students who inherited opportunities that previous generations had created through sacrifice and determination. At the world that had been transformed by the accumulated courage of people who refused to accept that limitations were permanent. "Mom," Maya said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had become exactly who she was meant to be. "Every difficult thing I ever did was worth it to create this moment, not just for me, but for everyone who comes after." As the sun set over the Afghan landscape that had witnessed Maya's transformation from underestimated support staff to military legend, mother and daughter stood together in contemplation of a legacy that had exceeded every expectation. The desert wind carried their memories across the landscape, but it also carried forward the promise that excellence, once recognized and developed, could never be contained by artificial barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Maya Chen had changed everything by refusing to accept that she was limited to what others expected. But her real achievement was proving that everything could be changed by people who had the courage to become who they were meant to be. Regardless of the obstacles that stood in their path, the desert stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over Maya during those pre-dawn training sessions, when she had prepared for a challenge that would define not just her own future, but the opportunities available to generations of people who would inherit the Kiev world her courage had helped create. Maya smiled, knowing that somewhere in the world, another young person was probably looking at those same stars and dreaming of achievements that others might consider impossible. The cycle would continue, carried forward by people who understood that excellence, once unleashed, could never be limited by the assumptions of those who confused tradition with truth. The legacy was secure, embedded not in monuments or records, but in the confidence of young people who took for granted that their potential would be recognized, developed, and utilized to its fullest extent. Maya Chen had shattered Colonel Hartwell's record 50 years earlier, but her real achievement was proving that some things, once broken, could never be reassembled, and that sometimes, that was exactly what the world needed. The desert wind whispered across the landscape where Maya had changed everything, carrying with it the eternal promise that human potential could not be maximized until artificial barriers were removed, that records existed to be broken, and that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, against internal limitations that prevented people from becoming who they were meant to be. Maya Chen had answered the question that had haunted her since that night in San Diego when she had chosen the harder path. She had discovered exactly who she was meant to become. And in the process, she had created opportunities for countless others to make the same discovery about themselves. The stars shone down on empty desert, but they illuminated a legacy that would inspire excellence for as long as human beings dreamed of exceeding the limitations that others assumed were permanent. Creating this epic story required tremendous time and effort to bring you this powerful narrative. If Maya's incredible journey inspired you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of courage and determination.